The morning sun rose as it always did, casting its warm glow over the small town of Glenville, Texas. A place where the pace of life was slow, and the sense of community ran deep. For years, people in this quiet town knew Pastor James Holloway as a man of faith, a man who stood in the pulpit every Sunday, delivering sermons that spoke of love, forgiveness, and salvation. His voice resonated in the hearts of his congregation, and his family was seen as the embodiment of all that was good and wholesome. But on one fateful night, everything that was once believed to be true was shattered, and a nightmare would unfold, a nightmare that no one could have anticipated. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening. A night like any other in the Holloway household. But when the evening came to a horrifying end, the town was left in disbelief, struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. Pastor James Holloway, a man who once preached about divine mercy, was accused of something so gruesome that it could not be easily understood. His wife, Sarah, had been brutally murdered, her body dismembered in a way that defied all reason. What led a man, a preacher no less, to commit such a monstrous act? How did a husband, a father, a pillar of the community, fall to the depths of this unthinkable violence? It all began with a simple test, something many families take for curiosity or even for peace of mind. A DNA test. The results from that test were like a bombshell. They revealed something that would tear apart everything James thought he knew about his own family. His wife, Sarah, the woman he loved, the woman he had built a life with, had kept a devastating secret. A secret that would turn his world upside down in a matter of hours. The test revealed that his father, the man who had been a guiding figure in his life, the man who had shaped his faith and values, was not just a mentor, but something far more insidious, a man who had fathered all 4 of his children. Imagine the shock. The devastation. The crushing betrayal. How could a man like James, who had devoted his life to serving the Lord and guiding others through their darkest moments, come to terms with such a truth? How could he reconcile the loving memories of a family he thought he understood, with the horrors of this revelation? The events that followed were swift and harrowing. In a night that would haunt the community forever, James Holloway's world shattered. The man who once stood tall in his faith was now standing in front of a tragic scene, his wife's lifeless body at the center of a gruesome crime. The very home that once represented love and family was now a crime scene. The police arrived to find something that would forever alter the perception of a man they once called a leader. A preacher, a man of God, was now a killer. But what drove him to this unspeakable act? In this video, we will explore the shocking details of this tragedy, from the devastating discovery that turned a man's world upside down, to the chilling aftermath of the crime. We will dive deep into the psyche of a man who thought he knew everything about his life, only to discover that everything he believed in had been a lie. Viewer discretion is advised, as this video contains sensitive content. The purpose of this documentary is not to sensationalize, but to inform and understand the implications of a crime that no one could have predicted. What happened inside the Holloway household? How did a preacher, once a symbol of faith, descend into darkness? And what does this tragic story tell us about the dangers of secrets that are buried too deep, and the consequences of the truths we may never be prepared to face? Stay with us as we uncover the details of this tragic and unsettling case. The journey ahead will reveal the complexities of betrayal, family, and the lengths to which a man can be pushed when the very foundation of his life is shattered. James Holloway was born and raised in the heart of Texas, where the sun blazed hot and the land stretched on for miles. His early years were shaped by a deep sense of community and faith, values that ran through his family like a river of tradition. His father, Reverend Daniel Holloway, was a respected figure in the town, a man who stood at the pulpit for decades, guiding the community with words of wisdom and compassion. From a young age, James found himself following in his father's footsteps, drawn to the comfort of the church and the solace it provided in times of uncertainty. As a boy, James was the quiet one. He was always present, always listening, absorbing every word his father spoke about the Bible, salvation, and redemption. His father was a stern man, but his love for his family was undeniable. James admired him, looking up to him as a role model, a mentor, and someone whose approval meant everything. After graduating from high school, James made the decision to attend seminary school, determined to follow the path of ministry and carry on his father's legacy. He quickly gained a reputation for his earnestness, his devotion to his studies, and his natural ability to connect with people. His professors spoke highly of him, and it was clear that James had the potential to become a powerful preacher in his own right. His charm, warmth, and genuine nature made him a beloved figure in the small circles he moved in. He was the kind of person you could trust, the kind of man you could turn to in times of crisis. It wasn't long before James met Sarah. She was a few years older than him, a local girl from a neighboring town, but there was an undeniable connection between them from the moment they met. Sarah was kind-hearted, passionate about her faith, and fiercely independent. She had grown up in a family that didn't quite share the same devotion to the church, but she had found her own path to God in her own way. They met at a local church event, one of those evenings where the air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of hymns floated through the air. It was a youth gathering, and James, having just finished seminary, had been asked to speak. Sarah was drawn to him immediately, her eyes fixed on him as he spoke about love and grace. He, in turn, noticed her energy and the way she listened with rapt attention. After the event, they began talking, and their connection grew. They spent hours discussing faith, life, and their dreams for the future. James was captivated by Sarah's intelligence, her wit, and her fierce commitment to doing good in the world. She was different from the women he had known before, she challenged him, made him think deeper, question more. Within a year, James proposed, and Sarah, with her warm smile and gentle nature, accepted. The two married in a small but beautiful ceremony at the church where they first met, surrounded by family, friends, and the congregation that had watched their love story unfold. The marriage seemed to be a perfect reflection of what James had always wanted, a life devoted to faith, family, and service to others. Together, they created a life that was rooted in the teachings of the Bible, a life built on love and commitment. James was soon appointed to lead a church in the small town of Glenville. It wasn't a large congregation, but it was a tight-knit community, one that saw James as more than just a preacher. He was their guide, their moral compass, the man they turned to in times of need. He and Sarah quickly became the faces of the church, welcoming, kind, and always available for those in need. They had 2 children of their own, Lucas, a bright-eyed boy with a mischievous smile, and Emily, their sweet daughter who had inherited Sarah's gentle spirit. Life seemed perfect. From the outside, the Holloway family was the epitome of what many people in Glenville aspired to be, successful, happy, and anchored in their faith. James and Sarah were always seen together, whether they were hosting church events or simply spending time with their children at the local park. They appeared to be the picture of devotion, both to their faith and to each other. But as is often the case, the perfect image can be deceiving. Behind the facade of a happy marriage, there were cracks. James and Sarah had their share of disagreements, moments of tension that simmered beneath the surface. Sarah, despite her outwardly calm demeanor, had her own struggles. She had never quite felt fully accepted by the church community, always feeling like an outsider, always carrying the weight of a past that she kept hidden from everyone, especially from James. In the years leading up to the DNA revelation, there were small signs of strain. Late nights spent apart, the distance that began to grow between them as James became more and more consumed by his role as a preacher. Sarah, on the other hand, was starting to feel isolated, caught between the expectations of being the perfect preacher's wife and the unspoken secrets she had been hiding from everyone, including her husband. But James, lost in his own world of sermons, parishioners, and the daily grind of leading a church, never suspected that anything could be wrong. He believed his marriage was strong. He trusted his wife implicitly. After all, they had built everything together: family, home, ministry. Their life was a testament to the power of faith and love. He never could have imagined that Sarah was hiding the truth, a truth so devastating that it would bring everything crashing down. The DNA test that would uncover the deepest betrayal of all would come at a time when the Holloway family was already at a crossroads, though James had no idea. He would never have imagined that the most painful revelation of his life was hidden within the very family he cherished the most. The love story that once seemed flawless was about to unravel in the most horrific way imaginable. This was the life James Holloway had built. This was the man he had become, a man of faith, family, and community. And yet, it was all about to be destroyed by one truth, one discovery, that no one could have ever seen coming. For years, James Holloway believed his life was built on a foundation of faith, trust, and family. His marriage, his children, his legacy, everything he had devoted himself to, felt unshakable. But one decision, one seemingly harmless curiosity, would send that foundation crumbling into dust. It all started with a simple idea. A DNA test. James had never questioned his children's paternity. They were his, he never had a reason to doubt it. Lucas had his strong jawline, Emily had Sarah's soft features. The other two children carried a mix of their parents' traits, just as any father would expect. But the test wasn't something James took out of suspicion or paranoia. It was a gift. A fun experiment. It was Sarah who first mentioned it, casually, in passing. DNA testing had become increasingly popular, with people discovering long-lost relatives and uncovering hidden pieces of their ancestry. One evening, while scrolling through her phone, Sarah had mentioned seeing an ad for a popular DNA testing service. It might be fun, she had said, to see where our ancestors came from. James had agreed without hesitation. There was no reason not to. In fact, the idea intrigued him. He had always been curious about his family's roots. His father, Reverend Daniel Holloway, had spoken little about their ancestry, always dismissing questions about their lineage with vague statements about their European heritage. But James, eager to pass down a sense of history to his children, found the idea appealing. So, one weekend, James ordered the test kits. The process was simple. A small vial, a quick swab of the cheek, and the samples were ready to be sent off. The children, excited by the idea of learning more about their family tree, participated eagerly. Even Sarah seemed enthusiastic. And then, they waited. Weeks passed. The church kept James busy, and the DNA test became nothing more than an afterthought. The results were expected to take some time, so life continued as usual. Sermons were delivered, prayers were spoken, and the Holloway family carried on, unaware that a storm was silently forming just beyond the horizon. Then, the email arrived. It was a quiet evening when James sat down at his desk to check his messages. The subject line read, "Your DNA results are in." He clicked the link without hesitation. At first, the results were exactly what he had expected. European ancestry, scattered origins, nothing surprising. But then, something caught his eye. A small section labeled parent-child match. His name was listed as a match for all four of his children. But directly below, under the section labeled grandparent match, his father's name appeared in a way that made James' stomach drop. Reverend Daniel Holloway wasn't just listed as the children's grandfather. He was listed as their biological father. James froze. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. He refreshed the page. Checked the details again. But the numbers, the percentages, the undeniable genetic markers, they all told the same story. His father was not just his children's grandfather. His father had fathered his children. The walls of his office seemed to close in on him. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. His hands trembled over the keyboard as he reread the results over and over, hoping, praying that he was misinterpreting them. But there was no mistake. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't a glitch. The implications hit him all at once, like a freight train to the chest. Sarah. His wife. The woman he had devoted his life to. She had betrayed him. Not just in a fleeting moment of weakness. Not with a stranger. She had betrayed him with his own father. The realization was a physical blow. His stomach twisted violently, bile rising in his throat. He pushed himself away from the desk, knocking over his chair as he staggered to his feet. How? How was this even possible? For a moment, James could hear nothing but the deafening roar of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Memories flooded his mind, Sarah's laughter, her whispered words of love, the way she had looked at him on their wedding day. And then, the image of his father. The man who had guided him through life. The man who had baptized his children. The man who had stood beside him in church every Sunday. He stumbled out of his office, his vision blurred, his mind clouded by a chaos of emotions he couldn't even name. Sarah was in the kitchen, washing dishes. She turned when she heard him enter, smiling softly. But James wasn't smiling. His expression was unreadable, stiff, pale, almost vacant. He held up his phone, the DNA results glowing on the screen. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "What is this?" Sarah's smile faltered. Her eyes darted to the phone, then back to him. "What?" she asked, her voice hesitant. James took a step closer, his breathing shallow. "What is this, Sarah?" he repeated, his voice hoarse, trembling. She reached for the phone, but James pulled it back. And at that moment, he saw it. The flicker of something in her eyes. Something unreadable. Something she was trying to hide. She knew. She had always known. The truth settled into his bones like ice. His entire world, the life he had built, the family he cherished, had been nothing but a lie. A carefully constructed illusion, held together by secrets he was never meant to uncover. James' pulse pounded in his ears. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sarah took a slow step back, her face draining of color. "James, I can explain." But James didn't want explanations. The DNA test had already told him everything he needed to know. The house was silent. Not the kind of peaceful silence that came with nightfall, but a thick, suffocating stillness, the kind that settled before something terrible happened. James Holloway sat in the dim glow of his study, the DNA results still open on his phone. His hands trembled as he read the lines again, though he already knew them by heart. His father. His wife. His children. The betrayal was absolute. For hours, James sat there, staring into the abyss of his own thoughts. The weight of the truth crushed him, pressing down on his chest like a vice. How long had they lied to him? How long had he been the fool? He thought of every tender moment with Sarah, every whispered, "I love you," every stolen kiss, every night spent lying beside her, believing she was his and his alone. And all the while, she had been hiding the most unforgivable secret. And his father, the man he had worshipped, trusted, followed. The man who had guided him through life had been the one to destroy it. Something inside James broke. A rage unlike anything he had ever known surged through him, swallowing him whole. It was a rage that came from betrayal, from humiliation, from the unbearable realization that his entire life had been nothing but a cruel joke. And in that moment, James knew. This could not go unanswered. Sarah was asleep when he entered the bedroom. The house was quiet, the children safely tucked in their beds. A framed wedding photo sat on the nightstand, a relic from a life that no longer existed. James stood over the bed, watching her sleep, his hands clenched at his sides. The rage inside him had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, darker, something beyond his control. Sarah stirred, her body shifting beneath the covers. She must have sensed something, some change in the air, some invisible shift in the man she had once called her husband. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the darkness. James? Her voice was groggy, confused. He didn't answer. In one swift motion, he reached down and grabbed her by the throat. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, her hands flying to his wrists as she struggled beneath him. She tried to scream, but his grip was too strong. Her legs kicked wildly, the sheets tangling around her as she fought for air. James didn't let go. His mind was blank, his vision red. The sound of her gasps filled the room, but he barely heard them. All he could see were the DNA results. All he could hear were the echoes of his father's voice, the lies, the betrayal. Her struggles weakened. Her hands clawed at his arms, but her strength was fading. And then, her body went still. The room was silent again. James sat there, breathing heavily, staring down at the lifeless woman beneath him. His wife. The mother of his children. The woman he had loved. She was gone. But the rage was still there. And it wasn't enough. Not yet. James moved mechanically, as if he were outside of his own body. He walked to the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a knife. The metal felt cold in his hands. With slow, deliberate steps, he returned to the bedroom. There was no hesitation. No second thoughts. What happened next was not quick. The knife sank into flesh, tore through muscle, severed bone. The air filled with the sickening sound of blade against body, the dull thud of limbs being separated, the wet, sticky heat of blood pooling onto the once pristine bed. James worked in silence, his breathing steady. His hands, his arms, his chest, soon everything was soaked in red. By the time he was done, Sarah was no longer Sarah. She was in pieces. And for the first time since reading those DNA results, James felt calm. When Sarah failed to show up for a scheduled church event the next morning, concerned friends called her phone. No answer. By noon, her closest friend, Angela, drove to the Holloway home. The front door was locked, but something felt wrong. The curtains were drawn. The driveway was empty. The house, usually so warm and welcoming, felt off. Angela knocked. Called out Sarah's name. No response. Her unease grew. She dialed James' phone. It went straight to voicemail. Something was very, very wrong. By late afternoon, Sarah's mother called the police. Officers arrived at the Holloway residence within the hour. They knocked. No answer. They tried again. Still nothing. But then, one officer noticed something. A dark stain near the garage door. A slow, seeping trail of red. And that was when they knew. Breaking down the door, the officers stepped inside and were immediately hit with the overwhelming stench of blood. And then they saw it. The horror. Sarah's body, or what was left of it, lay in the bathtub, dismembered, her remains wrapped in plastic bags. The bedroom, the hallway, even the walls bore the evidence of what had happened. James Holloway was nowhere to be found. The man who once stood at the pulpit, who once preached about forgiveness and love, was now a fugitive. And the town of Glenville, Texas, would never be the same again. The manhunt for James Holloway began immediately. The moment officers stepped into that house, into the blood-soaked remnants of what had once been a home, law enforcement knew they were dealing with something far more gruesome than they had ever seen. This wasn't just a murder. It was rage. It was personal. It was a man unraveling. But James Holloway, the preacher, the husband, the father, was gone. The manhunt begins. For 48 hours, there was no sign of him. Police issued an APB, broadcasting his face across local news stations. The town of Glenville, once a quiet and peaceful community, was now consumed by whispers, by rumors, by fear. No one could believe it. James. The preacher. The man who had baptized their children, who had counseled struggling marriages, who had stood before them every Sunday, preaching about love and forgiveness. How could he be capable of something like this? The congregation was in shock. The entire town was in shock. But the police knew one thing: James was out there. And he was running. He was found 2 states away, in the back of a roadside motel in Louisiana. A clerk had recognized his face from the news. He had checked in under a fake name, but something about him, his vacant stare, his shaky hands, the way he kept looking over his shoulder, had unsettled her. She called it in. By the time police arrived, James was sitting on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the wall. His hands were still stained, blood embedded deep beneath his fingernails. He didn't resist. He didn't run. When officers asked him if he understood why he was being arrested, he simply nodded. And as they placed the cuffs around his wrists, he muttered a single phrase under his breath. "I had no choice." Back in Glenville, the town crumbled under the weight of the truth. Sarah's mother was inconsolable. "I trusted him," she sobbed to reporters. "He was supposed to love her. He was supposed to protect her." Church members wept in the pews, unable to reconcile the man they had known with the monster that now sat in a jail cell. Some refused to believe it. "He must have been possessed," one elderly woman whispered. "This isn't the James the first knew. This isn't the James we all knew." But others, those who had seen the cracks beneath the surface, weren't so sure. "We thought he was perfect," one former congregant admitted. "But now I wonder if we ever really knew him at all." James Holloway was charged with first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and fleeing from law enforcement. The prosecution painted him as a man who had snapped, a husband whose rage and jealousy turned him into something inhuman. The defense tried a different approach. They argued that the DNA revelation had caused a psychological break, that the betrayal had destroyed him, pushing him into a state of temporary insanity. But the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. The brutality of the crime, the attempt to run, the calm, methodical way he had dismembered Sarah's body, these were not the actions of a man who had simply lost control. This was something much darker. After only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. James Holloway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His children, the children he now knew were not his own, were placed in the custody of Sarah's surviving family. And as he was led out of the courtroom, hands shackled, face hollow, he did not look back. Because there was nothing left to look back on. His life, his faith, his family, his legacy, was gone. And now, so was he. James Holloway had spent his entire life devoted to truth, preaching it, seeking it, believing that no matter how painful, the truth was what set people free. But the truth he uncovered didn't set him free. It destroyed him. Experts say that the human mind is built to handle gradual pain. We cope with losses over time. We adjust to betrayals slowly, processing them piece by piece. But what happens when your entire reality shatters all at once? For James, the DNA test was not just a revelation. It was an annihilation of his marriage, his father's legacy, his children's identities, and his own sense of self. Clinical psychologists refer to this kind of event as identity collapse, a psychological crisis where everything a person believes about their life is suddenly proven false. The human brain struggles to process it. Rage, numbness, paranoia, hopelessness. The emotions crash over the mind like violent waves, each one worse than the last. And for James, the collapse was total. Betrayal at the core of his existence. James didn't just lose trust in his wife. He lost trust in his entire reality. The woman he had devoted his life to had been lying to him for years. The man he had idolized, his father, had stolen the very foundation of his life. His children, the ones he had loved, raised, prayed for, were not his in the way he had always believed. So what does a man do when everything he loves turns against him? Some collapse inward, falling into deep depression, isolation, or even suicide. Others lash out, desperate to regain control of something, anything, even if it means violence. James Holloway chose the latter. The psychology of extreme reactions. Forensic psychologists have studied cases like James, and while his crime was gruesome, his psychological reaction was not unheard of. Dr. Robert Kessler, an expert in trauma psychology, explains. When a person is faced with an immediate, overwhelming betrayal, especially from multiple loved ones, there are two common responses: paralysis or action. Some people emotionally shut down, incapable of functioning. Others feel an uncontrollable need to correct the betrayal, to erase the source of their pain. It is a psychological fight-or-flight response, but in extreme cases, it becomes fight to the death. James' response wasn't just anger. It was an attempt to erase the lie. By ending Sarah's life, he wasn't just killing his wife, he was trying to kill the truth. His crime was horrifying. His actions were unforgivable. But in the end, James Holloway wasn't just a preacher who lost his faith. He was a man who lost everything, including himself. Sarah never expected the test to reveal her secret. Perhaps she thought the truth would die with her. But science had other plans. Can some truths do more harm than good? James Holloway's story is an extreme example of what can happen when DNA reveals a truth someone was never meant to know. His reaction was violent, monstrous, and unforgivable. But the question lingers. If he had never taken that test? If the truth had remained buried? Would Sarah still be alive? And if the answer is yes, then what does that say about the ethics of DNA testing? The story of James Holloway is one of faith, deception, and irreversible consequences. A preacher, a man devoted to guiding others, was driven to an unspeakable act by a truth he never expected to face. First, this case reminds us that the past does not always stay buried. Secrets, especially those tied to family, have a way of surfacing, and when they do, they can unravel lives in ways no one ever anticipated. Second, it forces us to consider the power of modern technology. DNA testing is a tool, one that has helped solve crimes, reunite families, and uncover long-lost histories. But it is also a force that can reveal truths that some people are not prepared to face. And finally, it raises a difficult but necessary discussion about how we handle betrayal, trauma, and psychological distress. James Holloway's actions were his own, but his story serves as a stark warning of what happens when pain turns into violence. When a man cannot cope with the truth he has uncovered. Now, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe James Holloway's actions were purely out of rage, or do you think something deeper was at play? And what about DNA testing? Should there be more caution before uncovering family secrets? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this video informative, be sure to like, subscribe, and share to help bring more true crime cases to light. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, because in our next video, we'll be covering another shocking case, one that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about trust, loyalty, and deception. Until next time, stay safe, and be careful what you uncover.